From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Donald Trump's nominee for Secretary of the Treasury warns of an economic crisis if the 2017 tax cuts are not extended. Scott Bessent also pledging the government will not default on its debt if he's confirmed. We'll have more on his confirmation hearing with Erica York at the Tax Foundation.
And we'll be joined by Maryland Governor Wes Moore, whose new budget proposal brings new taxes on upper earners. We'll talk with the Democrat on working with the new administration and carving his own path in politics.
And we'll sit down for a wide-ranging conversation on the economy, taxes, and the Fed with Bernstein, the outgoing chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Thanks for joining us on this Thursday edition. Not just any Thursday, but Scott Bessent confirmation hearing. Right. Thursday was hours of getting grilled by senators on both sides of the aisle regarding the economic policies of this incoming administration.
Although it was a cakewalk compared to the grilling that Pete Hegseth saw and some others might see, this was supposed to be the easy part of the process. It did last some time as senators from both sides of the aisle got a chance to talk with Scott Bessent about a number of issues, including extending the Trump tax cuts, which he reinforced today on the Hill.
This is the single most important economic issue of the day. This is pass-fail. That if we do not fix these tax cuts, if we do not renew and extend, then we will be facing an economic calamity. And as always, with financial instability, that falls on the middle and working class people.
And we want to discuss taxes at the state level as well, as Maryland Governor Wes Moore yesterday announced a budget plan that includes $2 billion in spending cuts and tax hikes for those making over $500,000 a year. And Governor Moore is joining us now to discuss. Governor, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. The rates we're talking about here, 6.25% tax on those making over $500,000 at 6.5% for over $1 million. You've pointed out that some 80% of Marylanders will either actually see a tax cut or see no increase at all. But for those who are going to experience a hike if this plan goes forward, how do you pitch this to them as a Democratic governor, knowing it might be contrasted with, at the federal level, a Republican president pursuing tax cuts?
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Kaylee. And I think about the budget that I introduced really had three North Stars that we were focusing on. One is that we had to prioritize cuts. We have $2 billion worth of cuts. And I had to be very strategic and very sober about this because the lens I was looking at was that the programs either had to be both effective and efficient and sustainable. If they were not effective and sustainable, they were going to be cut. So we had to take a really hard lens on that. The second piece was we had to do a better job of modernizing government. And that was getting our systems in place, making sure government is more efficient in the way that we did our work. And that alone is going to cut $50 million and save $50 million to Maryland this year alone. And the third piece was we had to reform our tax code. And when I talk about reforming the tax code, we now have 2/3 of Marylanders who are actually going to receive a tax cut. 82% are either going to receive a tax cut or no change at all, that we are lowering the corporate tax rate, that we are eliminating the inheritance tax and making it easier for businesses to be able to come and grow and stay in Maryland because we're prioritizing things like regulatory reform and permitting reform. And so this was about growth because the biggest challenge we were facing as a state was that while our budgets grew by 70% in the 7 years before I became the governor, our GDP grew by 3%. And so we were spending, but we weren't growing. So by being able to focus on these issues, we're able to grow our economy.
Boy, Governor, you know you're on Bloomberg when we start a conversation like this. You've been with us since the beginning on Balance of Power, and it's great to have you back today. And we've watched the tax debate evolve a lot in that period of time. When you go back to 2017, certainly, and now through the Biden administration and this debate that we're experiencing right now as Donald Trump takes office to extend the 2017 tax cuts. We're also talking about no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, so many other items, including salt. You have a workaround in your state when it comes to salt. I'm wondering if all of this is designed to get ahead of what's about to happen in Washington.
Well, one thing that we know is that what happens in Washington does impact what happens to us on the state level. That Washington is the only place that can print money. But that I know that this year, not only did I introduce a balanced budget for the third year in a row, I plan on passing a bipartisan balanced budget in my state. That we know that the work that happens in Washington does have direct impacts on us. And so as this new administration comes on board, I know that I am prepared to find common ground with this administration, that we've introduced 26 bills since I've been the governor of the state of Maryland. We have gone 26 for 26, and we've gone 26 for 26 bipartisan, with both Democrat and Republican support on every single bill that we have introduced. We know how to work across the lines. We know how to get things done together. And on places where we can find common ground with this new administration, we will. And on places that we feel that there is a need to push back, we'll do that as well. But we're entering into this new phase in a spirit of partnership.
Well, so as you kind of discussed two dynamics here, being a partner in some sense to an incoming administration and also being a foil to it as a governor of a blue state, which one do you think is going to take greater precedence?
Well, I'm very clear that, I am not the leader of the resistance. I'm the governor of Maryland. The people elected me to represent the 6.5 million people of this state and making sure that their dreams and their aspirations were going to be invested in and supported in, and their freedoms and their rights were going to be protected. And so we will work with anybody to be able to ensure that Maryland is able to have safer streets, and that Maryland can have a growing economy, and that Maryland can have quality infrastructure and the best public schools in America. And, it's the same way that, before I ever ran for office, I was in the business world and I was an Army officer. And we were very clear when I was 17 years old and I joined the Army, I learned a phrase, leave no one behind. And that is still my metric about whether or not I'm doing my job now, even as the governor of Maryland.
We heard Governor Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan speaking yesterday about the idea of trying to reach across the aisle, find common ground, work with this incoming administration. The fact of the matter is governors don't have a choice, right? You have something in common with mayors, your executives, and you have to work with the Trump administration. So what's your opening shot? What's your message to Donald Trump to get the ball rolling?
Our message is this, is that if you can work with their states and our states' executives, I can tell you right now that we'll be able to produce the kind of results that are the people in our states that they hope for. I think about what's happening in the state of Maryland, where when I was first elected, Maryland was 43rd in the country in unemployment. We're now going on 14 straight months of amongst the lowest unemployment rates in the entire country. That when I was inaugurated, that Maryland had gone 8 straight years where we saw over an 8-year period, the homicide rate in Maryland had nearly doubled. Baltimore City went 8 straight years of 300+ homicides. Now, 2 years into our administration, we've now seen some of the fastest drops in homicides and violent crime anywhere in the country here in the state of Maryland. And so the message that I really want to have to the new administration is when we're able to work together, and we're able to have partnership. The partnership produces progress. And I think it's progress that the American people, that they hoped for, that they voted for, and that they expect from leaders who are sitting in these seats.
Governor, we just have a minute left, but obviously Baltimore experienced a disaster last year with the collapse of the Key Bridge. Federal funding for that finally came through at the end of last year. I'm sure you're well aware there is now a conversation about putting conditions around aid for California as it grapples with the aftermath of fires. What would you say to those who are advocating for conditions on aid?
I'm never going to forget that first morning of when the Key Bridge collapsed. And when I saw 13% of my economy shut down, when I had 6 Marylanders who we lost and was trying to console those families. And the thing that I wanted to do that morning and that we continue to do was center on humanity and center on working together. That every single one of our press conferences that we had every single day, we were with the mayor, we were with our federal leaders, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Army Corps of Engineers, our federal delegation, Democrats and Republicans. We were with everybody united. And in these times of tragedy, What people are hoping for is that we can have a sense of unity in the way that we recover and in the way that we rebuild. And so I would urge, as California, and I know I reached out to Gavin and the folks in California that first morning, the thing that I would hope for them is that everybody who especially has to vote on this, go to California and see it for yourself. See the work, see the need, and then go out and make the right decisions on behalf of the people.
It's great to have you back, Governor. That's Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland.
Great to see you. Thank you.
Let's stay close as this new year unfolds. Coming up, our conversation with Jared Bernstein, the outgoing chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and his reflections on his time with the Biden administration and what might be next. It's on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. We thank you for joining us. Only 3 days left for the Biden administration. We sat down today with his top economic advisor, Jared Bernstein, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, as he wraps his time in the White House, reflecting on the administration's economic legacy and their battle against inflation. I want to start with the fight of your life, which I believe is the fight you waged against inflation for the last.
Oh, I thought you were talking about confirmation hearing.
I thought maybe you picked something else, but I think we can agree that's what you've spent the most of your time on, and it's what we've spent the most time probably asking you about. When you look at a chart over the last 4 years of CPI data, it looks like a mountain.
Yeah.
You crested the top of that mountain a couple of years ago, and as we look at that chart now, we'll share it with our viewers on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube. I wonder, one, how that makes you feel, if it brings back some PTSD.
There's traumas in some of those.
Yeah, I believe
peaks
that.
there, yeah.
But also, when you look at that, do you think, look how much progress we made, or how much left we had to do?
Both. Certainly progress we've made. I mean, coming down the other side of that mountain was critically important. But you know, Kaylee and Joe, for us, the fight was never just about getting inflation back down. That was absolutely key, and we're proud of the work we did to help that. Yeah. Specifically, by the way, the Supply Side Disruption Task Force. That's not something you hear a lot about that, but we were probably talking about it back in 21. The president realized quickly that it was snarled supply chains that helped cause that inflationary spike in part, along with strong demand, and unsnarling those chains was going to be really important. But the thing that the president recognized was that we also have to worry about costs, the price level, not just inflation. And that's why, starting shortly after that peak, we started talking about what we were doing to lower costs. Because it's one thing to get grocery inflation from 13% down to around 1.5%. That was a huge and important accomplishment. But that just means your grocery prices are growing more slowly. It doesn't mean they're coming down. And a lot of people really wanted more deflation, not just disinflation. So our cost-cutting agenda was also a critical piece of the fight.
Mm-hmm. Well, and your point is well taken on how supply side factors did ultimately contribute to the higher price pressures. But you mentioned demand there as well. And certainly you're familiar with the Republican argument that it was too much fiscal stimulus that fueled demand and fueled inflation as a result. When you look back on it now, do you think the ultimate trade-off was worth it? Keep the economy and the labor market in better shape through some of those stimulated efforts in exchange for what could have been that additional marginal pressure upward on prices?
I do, with the following asterisk or caveat, which is that if you look at the trajectory of inflation or the cumulative amount in which the price level grew across every G7 economy, it's pretty much the same in every one of them. And they all had different fiscal and monetary policies. So I think it's a mistake to assign too much of that increase to fiscal policy. And I think the Republican argument is fundamentally undermined by that international comparison. That said, the other part of the way you teed up the question is really important, which is what did we get? So we are now handing off one of the strongest economies on record, and by some really important measures, whether it's the number of jobs, a 4% average unemployment over this administration. That's an historical achievement. And of course, the stock market doing great in the past couple of years. All of those indicators do take you back to punching back as hard hard as we could against a pandemic-induced recession. So I want to be very careful about not suffering from any of the amnesia about what was going on in January 21 when we got there and how our policies helped get this economy back to full employment where it's been ever since.
You've been very disciplined about staying independent from the Fed and not answering our questions about the Fed for the last 4 years. I salute you for your consistency. Every now and then we got a little bit of a crack out of you when it comes to, I just wonder, I don't know if you feel more or less shackled now than you did in the throes of the administration, but did you feel in sync with the Fed from transitory to the first cuts?
Well, first of all, people ask me right now, what are you going to do after this job?
Yeah.
And one of the things I say is I'm going to talk about the Fed. So
hopefully here first.
Certainly going to remain pretty quiet about the Fed as long as I'm still chair of the CEA. I mean, look, I think one place I take your question is just how much we valued Fed independence. And that wasn't just some, weird kind of idea we had. We're just acutely aware that economies have been brought to their knees by compromising the independence of the central bank. And that's largely because of unforced errors on inflation. Now, in some cases, I think there are many critics who worry about the incoming Trump administration's policies in the context of being inflationary, whether it's deportation or tariffs or lots of tax cuts. And, I'm not going to go there myself. I want to give these guys a chance. Let's see what they do. They don't want higher inflation or interest rates. I think we can be pretty clear on that. But once you start messing around with Fed independence, I think you're making, a pretty fatal mistake in terms of controlling inflation.
Well, you just said they don't want higher inflation. But do you think ultimately, when you look at the layout of the policies, at least that they've outlined, if not into the granular details that we may have yet to get once Trump takes office, that is what is going to result, is that it's going to lead to a new spike upward in prices?
Kayleigh, again, I want to give this incoming team the benefit of the doubt. I know some of these folks, they're good economists. They don't want to generate higher inflation or higher interest rates. But if you do look at the impact of, say, sweeping tariffs or deportations or fiscal stimulus through unnecessary high-end tax cuts, really also hurting the economy's fiscal outlook, all of those, of course, are inflationary. And then if you add in compromising Fed independence, you've got a real problem on your hands. I don't think they want to go there. I will say the following. If there are those who think that, hey, we did tariffs in our first administration, and it didn't hurt us on the inflationary side. 2025 is a lot different than 2017, right? There you're looking at an economy where you were missing inflation from the downside for something like 5 or 10 years. There you're looking at an economy where interest rate yields were very low. Now you're talking about an economy where inflation is making its bumpy way path back to target, and yields are, if anything, going the other way. This is a very different climate to be considering those kinds of ideas. And I would say in that regard, they have fewer degrees of freedom. And again, I think they know that.
Independence, though, as a principle, is something that some would argue is being challenged right now by this incoming administration. The man who was just experiencing his confirmation hearing earlier today, Scott Bessent, the potential future Treasury Secretary, floated the idea of a shadow Fed chair. Is that our next reality?
I don't think so. I mean, again, I think there are things one says in sort of the think tank world.
Yeah.
The Bible says, when I was a child, I spake as a child, but then when I chaired the CEA, I had to get a lot more serious. And so I think
you're giving this team the benefit of the doubt.
I think that obviously that's what I've said that numerous times, and I want to pursue that. But I also think that the idea of hitting this economy with higher interest rates, higher inflation, I think any economists worth their salt know that that's not where we want to go.
We heard the president in his farewell address last night also say that he wishes the incoming administration success because he wants the country to succeed. And just a few minutes later, he went on to warn of what he sees as a burgeoning American oligarchy, talking about the concentration of wealth and power. And I wonder, from an economic standpoint, how you do view that, this widening inequality we are seeing take place in America.
Well, that's exactly how I view it. And I'm glad you went there, because when I heard the president talking about that, it brought me back to one of the first meetings I had with Joe Biden, our first extended meeting, which was in December of 2008, when he was the vice president-elect. It was at his house in Delaware, and he was looking for a chief economist, and I rumbled in there, and he pulled a graph out of his pocket, one that I had made, a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it, and it showed productivity going up, up, up. This is a graph that I'd made with Larry Michel, the great labor economist, and median wages, median incomes flat. And he pointed the gap between the two of those, and that's inequality. He said, this is what I want our work to address. I want to close that gap. And Bidenomics to this day, I describe, is that if you're helping to bake the pie, you ought to get a fair slice. So to me, what he said about this threat of excessive wealth concentration is part and parcel of his concern about the regular working middle-class Americans who build this economy every day getting their fair share of the growth.
Yet it must have frustrated him to not see them connect with his vision throughout polling. It was obviously a campaign that he dropped out of with the economy as the #1 issue here. So what was the most frequent question he would ask you, Jared? What was he actually waking up worried about when that was the dynamic you were dealing with?
Well, interestingly, you say frustrating, and it's an interesting point that makes me think back to conversations we had. He was constantly bolstering his staff, including me, saying, look, I know it's frustrating, to be seeing this out there, but I've been through this before. Wow. I've been to this rodeo, and we just have to keep pressing. We have to keep getting the economic job done on behalf of the American middle class. And so he was obviously very gratified to see, and this is something he and I worked on from the very beginning, going all the way back to our, throughout our relationship, was the idea that if you run a full employment economy, the benefits of the growth that you're helping to generate will disproportionately reach the bottom half. Well, look what's happened to wages. I know you've talked about this and documented this at Bloomberg. Low wages did the best. Low wage growth was the strongest. That comes right out of this running this Biden-esque full employment economy. The black unemployment rate over Joe Biden's 4 years was the lowest on record of any 4-year term. All right? That's huge support for, I think, the president's theory of the case. Now, you can ask about the disconnect between that and politics. I think that takes us back to the price level and that discussion. But the president was well aware of this architecture of how the economy works and recognized the progress we made on it.
Our conversation with Jared Bernstein, outgoing chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. And as for the incoming Trump economic team, Treasury Secretary nominee Scott Bessent testified before the Senate Finance Committee today as he seeks confirmation for the role. And joining us now for a closer look is Bloomberg's Laura Davison. So, Laura, he's obviously seen as an easier confirmation, and it certainly was an easier hearing, it seemed, personality-wise, compared to what Pete Hegseth experienced yesterday.
Yes, this was a much more calm hearing, much more questions that were focused on, issues that you would expect to be talked about, tariffs, taxes, the federal budget. But one thing was clear is that Bessent, while he's viewed to be a relatively qualified candidate, he's still going to have some on-the-job learning to do. There were several questions about Medicare, about the Congressional Budget Office on scoring of tax policies and different specific tax credits and other programs that he just sort of, you could tell there was a little bit of fear in his eyes. And I'm going to have to get back to you on that. He probably said that 6 or 7 times throughout the course of the hearing. It's clear that he will be on his way to confirmation, potentially, among the first to go through after Trump is inaugurated.
He would frequently say, I'll get back to you on that if I'm confirmed. So I guess that's not going to be an issue in terms of getting the job. This does seem to be a bit of a coronation in the way it's being framed. Could he be a day one confirm, as we're hearing that John Thune wants to see on January 20th on Monday?
It's very possible he could be, and if not, early in the week there. When we heard Bessent say it today that extending the tax cuts are the #1 priority issue for him in that role. We've heard the same thing from Republicans in Congress who, has said they want to get this done by Easter. We'll see if that's, even possible. But they know that they need to get this team in place if they want to achieve some of the big legislative things they want to do with a little time.
Well, and on those legislative things they have to do in our final minute here, Laura, he was pressed by Elizabeth Warren on the debt ceiling and did suggest if Trump decides he wants to repeal it entirely, he would work with him on that. Was that surprising to you?
This is a little bit surprising, but this is where you see Trump as an unconventional candidate whose politics don't align with the Republican Party. There was a funny line from Warren. She said, look, Elizabeth Warren and Donald Trump are singing from the same panel. Yeah. That doesn't happen a lot, but this is a question that is going to have to be answered this year. And so we could see some interesting politics and interesting bedfellows crop up here.
Let's see how that goes over in the House with the Freedom Caucus. There's so many different factions to please here. Bloomberg's Laura Davison will help us through it all. Thank you so much, Laura. And coming up, a closer look at policy ideas that were floated during that confirmation hearing for Scott Bessent today. Erica York will join us, Vice President of Tax Policy at the Tax Foundation. And Kaylee, we've got a rocket launch coming up here that's going to land right in the middle of Balance of Power.
That's
the
right.
7th test launch of SpaceX's Starship. If things go as scheduled, We're about 10 minutes away.
Yeah, and we should see that super heavy booster return to the chopsticks. So it's going to make for some good TV and good radio as well. So stick with us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
No tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime, and perhaps making auto loans tax deductible again. That would go a long way towards addressing this affordability crisis.
Treasury Secretary nominee Scott Bessent testifying before the Senate Finance Committee today when asked about new potential tax cuts. And joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Erica York, Vice President of Federal Tax Policy at the Tax Foundation. Erica, welcome to Balance of Power. Obviously, we heard pretty strong advocacy for tax cuts from Scott Bessent and other Republicans on this panel in the Senate today. But where is the line between tax cuts that help address affordability by putting more pockets into Americans, or putting more into Americans' wallets, rather, versus giving them more money to spend and then fueling inflation, potentially making affordability issues worse?
Yeah, as lawmakers think about what types of tax cuts to prioritize, it'll be really important that they look at tax cuts that really boost important economic incentives, like incentives to invest, to save, and to work. And it'll also be important to balance that with structurally sound policies. So we don't really want a tax reform that just cuts taxes for the sake of taxes and perhaps makes the tax code more complicated and less neutral in the process. Unfortunately, several of those ideas that Trump proposed on the campaign trail, like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, creating this new deduction for auto loan interest, those would muck with the structure of the tax code, and they wouldn't really create powerful economic incentives to grow the economy.
So when you talk to Scott Bessent, and we've had the opportunity before he was tapped for Treasury Secretary to ask him about the potential inflationary and even deficit driving impact of extending the tax cuts and pairing them with tariffs, he makes the point that you can't take each of these in a vacuum, that they become a mosaic of economic policy that will have an impact that many economists don't understand. Most economists tell us that this is likely not to work. And we've seen the reaction, of course, in the bond market when it comes to interest rates. Did he create the mosaic that convinced you that these will work in union with each other?
So I think when we talk about what happens to inflation, ultimately that depends how the Federal Reserve reacts to fiscal policy. You could see an instance where really large tariffs create a shock to labor markets that requires the Fed to accommodate, where then we would see the price level rise. But I think that really obscures the point of what happens in the long run. What is the real economic change that's created by the combination of tax and tariff policies that Trump pursues? Whether the short-term reaction to that involves inflation or not, we need to make sure that the policies that are being crafted actually improve economic incentives in the long run. So we've modeled the effects of, the combination of tariffs and tax cuts at Tax Foundation, and we've found that for about the bottom half of the income distribution, they would be worse off under the combination of policies that Trump campaigned on, and a lot of the long-run economic benefit of better tax policy would also be offset by higher tariffs that invite foreign retaliation. So while these short-term transition questions, the reaction of the Federal Reserve, for instance, to higher tariffs, to larger deficits are important, it's also important to think about that longer-term impact and what are we doing to incentives that businesses and individuals face.
Well, and when we talk about the distribution here, lower income versus higher income, when you consider something like the SALT cap, Erica, which by and large does have greater appeal to higher income households, what economic incentives would lifting that really create?
So it does have changes in marginal tax rates. When you uncap SALT, you reduce marginal tax rates. You can also see an impact in housing investment. But when you think about it as a whole, broadening the income tax base by eliminating or even capping itemized deductions is a really good way to offset the revenue cost of lowering those marginal tax rates. And that's what the first iteration of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did. It followed that idea of broaden the base, lower the rate, so you get a simpler, more neutral structure of the tax system. and you get lower tax rates. Doing a higher SALT cap, getting rid of the cap altogether, would really be a worsening of the structure of the tax code. And it would be an unfortunate development because it would mean in the reconciliation process, we're using more revenue to uncap SALT, which means we have less revenue to use for these really powerful pro-growth tax policies.
Just have about a minute left. Erica, when you consider the debate that's about to begin here, we're talking about SALT. You can add so many of the other promises that came on the campaign trail, from no taxes on tips to overtime, and we could sit here listing them for a while. When you consider the politics at play here, how much of this beyond the 2017 tax package do you think will realistically be part of this reconciliation bill?
Not too much, because if you just look at the cost of extending the TCJA alone, that's going to run $4 to $5 trillion over the budget window. That's a tough pill to swallow when deficits are already running at $22 trillion over the budget window.
Yeah.
So the budget math just gets really difficult when you try to add some of these big ticket items like no tax on overtime. You could probably see something like no tax on tips get added that has a smaller price tag associated with it. But anything major is going to be tough just given the deficit pressures.
I guess Byron Donalds will be happy to hear about that. Erica, it's great to have you with us. Erica York, Vice President, Federal Tax Policy at the Tax Foundation. Thanks for your insights today. And thank you for being with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons as we take a turn to space, and more specifically SpaceX in the final countdown here for launch of the 7th flight test of its Starship vessel. For those of you on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube, we have a live look here at the launch pad in Texas. And Kaylee, we're just about 30 seconds away from this test flight.
Yeah, and there's going to be a few important things that happen here. Of course, this is a super heavy booster attached to the spaceship rocket. At a certain stage, after a few minutes after the launch, they will separate, and that super heavy booster will try in controlled fashion to descend back to Earth and be caught in between the mechanical chopsticks of this structure. It's all part of the effort to be able to reuse these rockets repeatedly, and we're now about 15 seconds away from liftoff, Joe.
We'll keep our ears and eyes on this for you. Again, this is Test Flight 7 as we approach our final countdown, an unmanned mission to orbit that we're going to walk through together here. Let's watch and listen live.
We have liftoff.
We have liftoff of Starship just now clearing the tower on a beautiful day in Texas. Look at that shot, Kaylee.
Off the starbase, of course, in Boca Chica, Texas. And we should note, this is an upgraded Starship. They're referring to it as a new generation ship with upgrades to its performance, its flaps, the heat shields on this, as well as a propulsion system as well. Keeping in mind, there's going to be a few new things that are happening with this particular flight, as this is flight number 7. It's going to be the first time this Starship tests deploying payloads, specifically Starlink satellites.
That's absolutely right. Satellite simulators, they're being called. They'll actually fall back to Earth with the super heavy booster. This is live video and live sound as we watch the rocket attempt to reach altitude.
Vehicle supersonic.
We're now supersonic and approaching the flight moment here of maximum stress, Kaylee, as we wait to find out if we'll have a successful separation.
Yeah, so we've just hit max Q. That is the moment of peak aerodynamic stress on the rocket, and it will be just a few minutes from now. We will see that separation occur between the Super Heavy booster and the Starship itself. And as we watch all of this unfold, we want to go now to an expert when it comes to space. Kieth Cowing, editor at NASAWatch, is with us for the 7th flight test. Kieth, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio as we watch the engines that will begin to cut off just less than a minute from now. Just walk us through what it is we're seeing and how crucial this next stage before separation will be.
Well, the whole idea is a dance between two giant tubes that are taller than a lot of the buildings outside your office in New York. And the idea is that one of the stages fires its engines, stops, the one on top begins to fire just before the bottom falls off so that it's a perfect, just, you don't have anything wobbling around. And it's a dance. The first time they tried it, the rocket blew up. The second time, there wasn't a problem. The most recent time they did it, it worked perfectly. But this whole flight is a bunch of these spiraling, gyrating, monstrous rocket things that have to be controlled as if it was a ballerina on a stage. And that's the most astonishing thing about this.
We can't do a launch without Kieth Cowing and his props. There is the separation live on Bloomberg with the view from space. Pretty remarkable here, Kieth. This looks like a successful launch so far. Now that super heavy booster will fall back to the Earth for the chopsticks capture that you were talking about.
Yeah. Now, rocket science involves, it's getting kind of simple now. Everybody knows what a chopstick is, and this is kind of literally what they do. They grab it. Sometimes rocket science could be very simple, practical ideas as opposed to complicated things that NASA sometimes would do.
Well, Kieth, I mean, I'm sure the idea of just catch something between the mechanical arms seems like it's pretty straightforward, but this has to be incredibly difficult physically to do, right? They are trying to reignite things in space and control a descent back to Earth just a few minutes after it blasted off.
Yeah, well, again, I don't know where your studio is, but just look out the window and imagine one of those things just disappeared and it's coming back. And it's got to come down so that, it comes down right so that it doesn't hit the taxis and it comes right back next to the sidewalk perfectly. And they did it one time before, so at least they know how it works. They're going to try it again. Plus, the top part of the spacecraft will also do that. They've launched it this time with the little hooks to see how they perform during the flight. They're not going to try and catch it this time, but possibly the next flight they'll try that as well. And then you know how to do a completely reusable spacecraft.
For those of you with us on Bloomberg Radio, thanks for being with us here as we walk through Test Flight 7 here, SpaceX Starship, with a separation successful, a heavy booster, super heavy booster falling back towards Earth. Kieth, we know that there's a payload here that'll be deployed from Starship, if things go properly at least. Without a nose cone, though, they actually have to be ejected from a special hatch that opens, not, I guess, unlike the space shuttle, which would have its cargo bay open. In this case, they're simulated satellites that are the same size as Starlink satellites. What is actually being tested? What are we learning?
Well, if I had one of those little Pez candy dispensers here, which I don't, the idea here is they have a little slot that opens up and they shoot out about a dozen of these. They're the same shape and size and weight. And the idea is to see if you can launch the Starship, do all the things that it takes to get into the right orbit and so forth, and then just shoot these things out. They're just interested in how to deploy them, and they don't bother putting electronics on them, and everything will come back in and re-enter at the same time. But, incrementally, this is a consumer product. They're making the spaceship longer, better avionics to move the wings around. Every time they do a flight, they look at what went wrong, what went right, and they move a step forward. And this is why, with NASA, they only launch one rocket every 3 years. These guys are launching them. They make them like corn silos, and they launch them like jets. And the idea is you get your knowledge faster. And again, this is a consumer product you're watching, just like the Blue Origin one was last night.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, Kieth, because I know in the wee hours of this morning that you were paying attention to that as well. They did have some success, though not in the second stage, which with the booster, which actually was destroyed as it attempted to land back in the Atlantic Ocean. Kieth, can you just speak to how more advanced SpaceX is with its technology at this stage than Jeff Bezos' company?
Advanced is a word that you might want to use, but actually it's just they haven't done enough of these landings yet to get it just right. Because if you look at what they tried to do at SpaceX, they had a blooper reel. They tried like a dozen times and it didn't work. So it's a whole thing of just refining the software. And here we are now. You can see it coming in. Oh, this looks like everything looks perfect. There comes the final landing burn. Okay, then they're going to drop that down to one engine, and then hopefully the chopsticks will grab it. Here we go.
We are go for booster catch. If you're listening on Bloomberg Radio, the chopsticks are open. The booster
Down to 3 engines.
appears to have been caught.
Wow.
A successful catch in the chopsticks. Kieth, it's just like you told us it would happen.
Yeah. Aren't I amazing? Yeah, I mean, it's practice makes perfect. I mean, it's literally what's going on here, and that's the ethos behind this rocket and many of the other commercial rockets you see now, which, again, is a departure from the way that the government rockets go, where they're like, oh my God, we got to make sure it's all perfect. We don't want to lose anything. These guys will lose a rocket if they can gain experience to keep other rockets from having the same problem.
Well, and all of this is an effort at a much bigger picture goal here, Kieth. Elon Musk wants to be able to get to Mars. With incremental progress like this, a second successful catching of a reusable rocket, how much closer do we get to achieving that goal?
Every one of these flights, you might ask me, would I get on this? I'll get on it when Elon does, okay? It's the issue of just incrementally getting closer to where the reliability is such that you can then put precious payloads, whether it's people or expensive satellites. And so they're getting closer. And I think at some point soon, you may see one of these test flights actually throw some actual Starlinks out there as just part of the constellation. And they'll just build up to that ability. But the size of this thing, a Falcon 9 can launch a couple dozen of these. This can launch 100 or more.
Well, we're not doing any of these without you, Kieth. So you're coming back for the next one, right?
Okay.
Kieth Cowing. Yeah, okay. He's editor at NASAWatch and will be with us for test flight number 8, a successful landing, successful launch, successful capture for SpaceX today as we experience live together here on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg. Coming up, our political panel will join us as we return to Earth here and acknowledge our reality on Capitol Hill. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The one big beautiful bill strategy makes the most sense. Remember that the Senate has 53 Republicans. In the House, I've got 220. I'll have a few less when those leave to join the administration. So it's a very complicated set of factors that we have to deal with. We have a very diverse conference, much more diverse than the Senate Republicans. And so I think at the end of the day, and hope that they will heed our call for the one bill strategy. The President Trump still prefers that. He and I talked about it today. He wants to get all this done in one big sweeping bill, and I think that's the best way to deliver it and get it over the line.
House Speaker Mike Johnson last night on Fox News confirming that President-elect Trump prefers one big reconciliation bill, and the Speaker has set for himself a tight time frame to get that done. Joining us now for more on Bloomberg TV and radio is this evening's political panel. Sarah Chamberlain, President and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership and Republican strategist, alongside Roger Fisk, Democratic strategist and former aide to President Obama. Welcome to you both. Welcome back to Roger. Sarah, just to begin with you on this one bill that Speaker Johnson is advocating for. We just today got a letter from the House Freedom Caucus saying you want 218 votes, make it 2. So where do we land on this?
I think it's going to end up being one bill. The members of the Republican Main Street Partnership want one bill. They think they can actually pull some of the Democrats over to vote for the one bill scenario. And he's right. President Trump does prefer one bill. And Senator Thune is okay with one bill. I don't think two bills would pass the House, and I think that's really the huge issue here.
Well, who's tired of talking about this? This has been the conversation for, I think, 3 weeks now.
Yes.
I mean, God, how many times? Do Democrats care? Are they a no either way, or is that true? Will they come over if it's under the right scenario, and it might include the border, Roger?
I mean, if it ends up being so big and so broad that it's everything from SALT to debt ceiling to on and on, I do agree with Sarah that it makes the most sense to have that be one bill. Two bills, I think you end up having. The second one is problematic by definition because after you go through the first, there's perceived slights, grudges, and et cetera. People lost, people won. Yeah. In the internal push and pull, I don't think you're going to see votes from Democrats for any of this. But I understand on the president-elect side why he wants to do this all at once, because if nothing else, I have no problem saying that he has a great sense of optics and he wants to come out of the box strong.
Well, and when he wants something, he does tend to be able to get it, at least when it comes to the Republican conference. And I wonder, Sarah, if we should include in that a new chair for the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Turner, out of the role. And he said he was told it was concerns from Mar-a-Lago. What have you heard on that?
So I'm actually very close to Congressman Turner. He's a member of the Republican Main Street Partnership. He's good. He's a wonderful statesman, but he upset, President Trump a couple times with some of the things he said. He's a strong advocate of Ukraine funding, so I think a lot of that played into it. And he lost yesterday. He lost his chairmanship.
So the call did come from Mar-a-Lago. is what you're
It's
hearing.
my understanding is
Wasn't
yes.
Mike Johnson acting on a whim here? He said the panel needed a fresh start. Is there some truth to that?
There's always a little truth to that. You can always reboot. I think it's healthy to do that. But Congressman Turner, you know, he's a statesman, and he's kind of an old-fashioned type Republican, kind of a throwback. He's been here a few years, and he speaks his mind, and occasionally that's against what Trump
Make
would
you wonder
prefer.
where policy to Ukraine is going to be going from here.
Well, especially when you consider the kind of statesman that Trump has picked to be in his second administration, Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, leaving open, Roger, a Senate seat in Florida. And we learned today that Governor Ron DeSantis will appoint Florida's current Attorney General, Ashley Moody, to the seat. It was going to be a Republican in the seat either way. Does it ultimately matter?
Well, I'm surprised Vivek Ramaswamy wasn't trying to go for it, because I guess there's some lobbying of Ohio as well. There's no mystery to any of that. I think Ron DeSantis is still trying to get back into good graces, which is why he was willing to, I think, be publicly floated as a SecDef kind of backup plan. But it's a common sense choice. I think she's going to be a loyal GOP vote in the Senate, and which, let's be honest, a lot of people, when they're appointed to fill out terms, essentially that's what they're there to do. Senator Kaufman, for example, when
she was a big part
President
of Ron
Biden became
DeSantis' attack on Disney, right? Remember "Don't Say Gay," the law. I mean, the whole drawn-out battle against Walt Disney was endorsed by this person who was joining the Senate. What does that mean for Senate policy and its approach to business?
Well, Governor DeSantis has clearly telegraphed a comfort level with getting into these cultural wars. So I think when he looks at it beyond the first level of value, which is making his number one constituent in Florida happy before that constituent moves into the White House, that it is building the profile and the resume of Governor DeSantis in those cultural wars so that he can then turn around in 4 years and say, I've been doing all this heavy lifting, et cetera.
Yeah.
So we may not be seeing the CEO of Disney at the inauguration on Monday, but we are, Sarah, going to be seeing a lot of other big tech executives specifically, not just Elon Musk, but Bezos, Tim Cook. Sundar Pichai is going to be there, even the CEO of TikTok. And I do wonder what Republican members of both the Senate and the House, especially those who voted to ban TikTok, think and have been very skeptical of big tech broadly. Think about the optics of that.
So I'm not surprised that the CEO of TikTok, I would be there if I was the CEO. I think most of the House members and the senators, it's in the hands now of the Supreme Court. So we're going to wait and see what the Supreme Court decides.
But for everyone else, putting big tech literally on the platform with you,
it's not that surprising, really. I mean, you've got
who voted to ban the company because
TikTok,
it was a danger to America.
Well, he's not going to be on the
I know
dais,
that, but you've got lawmakers in the lurch now sitting up there with this guy who they said was a danger to Americans. It does have a strange look, no?
A little bit, but he's not sitting up there. He is going to be down in the seats in front. You've got Elon Musk and others that are actually sitting up there. Yes, and Elon Musk, I mean, he's got an office now. He will have in the White House.
That's a whole
so it's
other
not.
show.
Yeah, it's not surprising.
Well, and the people we're referring to here, I believe, is what Joe Biden was referring to last night when he warned of a burgeoning American oligarchy last night. Roger, we just have a minute left, but what did you make of his farewell address?
He's trying to lay down a marker, obviously, in a very kind of Eisenhower kind of way. And I think he's trying to be very clear about the nexus of, I'm very vague, I'm very concerned when elected officials bring in very powerful people with vague mandates. They can kind of insert and pull out of any number of different dynamics and essentially kind of be professional dilettantes. I don't know to what extent that he's going to benefit by having such a broad, vague mandate. And for a party that was convinced that Jack Smith wasn't constitutional, I'd be curious what the actual constitutional underpinnings are of this body that he's about to lead and what kind of powers it actually has when it comes to governing.
Great conversation with Roger Fisk back at the table. Sarah Chamberlain, thank you so much. But did you see the chopsticks? Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
And we should note, SpaceX has lost communication with the Starship. We'll have more ahead on Bloomberg.